My name is Kinsley Williams. I am 30 years old. Right now, I am sitting at a banquet table under the live oaks in Point Clear, Alabama. 50 of my relatives are staring at me in dead silence. My mother, Valerie, stands at the head of the table next to a high-definition outdoor projector screen. Displayed behind her is an itemized spreadsheet titled, "The Cost of a Disappointment." The bottom line sits in bold red text, $412,750. She just told the entire family I owe her this money for the wasted sacrifices she made raising me. She is holding out a gold pen demanding I sign a promissory note right here in front of everyone. They expect me to crumble. They want me to run away in tears. Here is what none of them realize. I am a forensic accountant. I hunt stolen assets for a living, and my mother does not know that I spent the last 3 weeks tracking that exact dollar amount back to a federal crime she committed against her own family. I do not cry. I pick up my phone, tap a single button to hijack her projector connection, and end her reign with 2 simple words. By the time the sun sets over Mobile Bay, my mother will be sitting alone on this patio, holding a DOJ settlement offer. Welcome to Revenge Order. Before I tell you how a spreadsheet destroyed a family dynasty, hit the subscribe button. Tell me in the comments, how old are you right now, and what is the most insane guilt trip a toxic relative ever tried to lay on you? Let me take you back to the start of the afternoon. August in Lower Alabama feels like breathing underwater. David, my husband, parked our car near the front gates of the rented estate. The property was sprawling. Wraparound porches, Spanish moss, and catered staff carrying silver trays of crab cakes. Valerie spared no expense for this family reunion. She needed the perfect stage. My sister Jessica arrived 10 minutes after we did. Valerie always introduces us in a very specific order. Jessica is the successful real estate broker, the perfect daughter who stayed close to home and married a pediatric surgeon. When Valerie gets to me, she waves her hand and says, "Abigail looks at tax forms all day." She says it the way you describe a mundane chore. I walked into the courtyard and felt the air shift. Relatives I had not seen in 5 years offered tight smiles. Aunt Diane hugged me, but her grip was rigid. Uncle Richard asked if I was finally going to pay my own way today. The whispers were already circulating. Valerie spent weeks planting the seeds, phone calls hinting that I was ungrateful, cryptic social media posts about children who take their mothers for granted. We sat down for the main luncheon. The heat was stifling despite the oversized fans humming in the corners of the tent. I watched Jessica pick at her salad. Her hands trembled slightly when she reached for her water glass. Dark circles hid beneath her expensive concealer. She did not look like a woman enjoying a family party. She looked like a hostage. Then came the sound, a silver spoon tapping against crystal. Valerie stood up, smoothing her peach linen skirt. The ambient chatter faded. The caterers stepped back into the shadows. "I want to thank you all for gathering here," Valerie said. Her voice carried that distinct southern drawl engineered to coat venom in honey. "I planned this beautiful weekend to celebrate family, but true family requires honesty, and honesty requires accountability." She pressed a button on a remote. The screen behind her flickered from a slideshow of childhood photos to the spreadsheet. A collective gasp rippled across the tables. "Abigail," she said, turning her gaze to me, "you have drained me. It is time you pay back what you took." I did not flinch. I did not avert my gaze. When you spend your professional life hunting financial phantoms across corporate databases, you learn how to detach your pulse from the room. I let the silence stretch. It is a specific tactical maneuver I utilize during hostile depositions. People despise dead air. They will inevitably fill it with their own nervous energy if you let them wait long enough. All around the horseshoe-shaped banquet table, cell phones began to vibrate. Short, sharp bursts hummed against the polished wood and the crisp white linen. It was our family group chat. I had muted the conversation thread hours ago, but I knew exactly what was transpiring across those glowing screens. 50 relatives were simultaneously judging the spreadsheet's line items, gossiping across the digital ether, while sitting mere inches apart. The older generation texted their outrage. The younger cousins sent wide-eyed emojis. Everyone operated as a unified jury, rendering a verdict on my supposed greed. Uncle Richard broke the physical quiet. He sat 3 chairs down from my left side, gripping a crystal tumbler of straight bourbon. Richard is a man who builds his fragile ego on borrowed authority, which usually flows directly from my mother's bank account. "I cannot fathom the sheer arrogance," he muttered. His voice carried deliberately over the steady hum of the oscillating patio fans. He wanted the surrounding tables to hear him. He leaned forward, his face flushed red from the southern heat and the liquor. "After everything Valerie did to keep your head above water, you sit there staring like a statue," Richard said. "Have some decency, Abigail. Give your mother the respect she earned." I looked away from Richard and surveyed the perimeter. The architecture of this ambush was brilliant. Valerie rented a high-end venue bordered by the deep waters of Mobile Bay on one side and a heavy wrought iron security fence on the other. The banquet tables were arranged so that she maintained the visual high ground standing on a slightly elevated stone terrace. I sat trapped in the lowest center point of the horseshoe. A captive audience boxed me in, forming a human barricade. This is exactly how toxic family systems operate. They rely entirely on the spectacle. They bank on the assumption that the designated scapegoat will swallow the humiliation just to maintain the illusion of peace. They assume you will shrink away because causing a scene at a catered luncheon violates the unspoken regional code of conduct. Valerie paid a premium for this waterfront estate because she essentially bought an arena where my compliance felt mandatory. She designed a scenario where defending myself would look like an unhinged attack on a grieving mother. Beneath the heavy tablecloth, I felt a sudden shift. David slid his hand over my knee. His palm was warm and remarkably steady. My husband builds custom cabinetry for a living. He understands how raw materials are put together, and he knows exactly how much pressure a joint can take before the wood splinters. He did not whisper empty reassurances. He did not lean in and tell me to calm down. He just anchored me to the present second, reminding me that I was not fighting this battle in isolation. I took a slow breath, letting the humid air expand my lungs. My focus shifted back to the head of the table. Specifically, my eyes locked onto the woman sitting immediately to Valerie's right. Jessica, my older sister, the undisputed golden child of our bloodline. According to our family lore, Jessica is the flawless blueprint. She runs a boutique real estate brokerage downtown. She drives a pristine imported luxury SUV. Her children wear monogrammed clothing to expensive private schools. She is the daughter who stayed close to home, the daughter who listened, the daughter who never questioned the established narrative. But evaluating her now, my forensic instincts flared. The visual data did not match the pristine presentation. Jessica wore a beautiful silk wrap dress, but the fabric hung loosely on her frame as if she had dropped 10 pounds in a single month. Her posture was unnaturally rigid. The knuckles gripping her linen napkin were bone white. She looked physically ill. A faint sheen of sweat gathered at her temples despite the proximity of a heavy-duty cooling fan blowing directly on her section of the table. Underneath the table, her right foot tapped a frantic, erratic rhythm against the stone patio. Jessica leaned forward. She deployed her trademark tone. The concerned, nurturing sibling, the soothing voice she used to smooth over Valerie's rough edges for 3 decades. "Abby, please," Jessica pleaded. Her voice cracked, sending a ripple of sympathy through the viewing relatives. Aunt Diane pressed a hand over her heart. "Just apologize," Jessica continued. "Look at what this stress is doing to Mom. Her blood pressure has been dangerously high all month. Just make things right. Acknowledge the debt, and we can end this nightmare before it ruins the whole weekend." I studied my sister's face. Her eyes darted frantically between my stoic expression and the glowing projector screen behind our mother. That was the first visible crack in the foundation. Jessica was not pleading out of concern for our mother's cardiac health. I saw raw, unfiltered panic in her gaze. She was desperate for me to accept this fake debt. Why? Why would my highly successful older sister care if I paid a fraudulent invoice for childhood piano lessons and teenage living expenses? It made zero logical sense, unless my refusal to pay somehow threatened her own survival. I turned my analytical attention back to the massive screen. The red text glared in the afternoon sun. $412,750. If a narcissist wants to fabricate a bill for emotional labor, they pick a round number. They demand $500,000. They demand $300,000. They do not demand a figure ending in exactly $750. In the world of fraud investigation, highly specific numbers are never random. They are the undeniable fingerprints of a real deficit. A specific sum means a specific hole exists somewhere else in a ledger. Someone is trying to plug a leak. Valerie did not calculate that number by adding up my childhood receipts. She needed that exact amount of cash to cover something she had already spent. And judging by the hollowed-out, terrified look on Jessica's face, the golden child was intimately connected to whatever financial crater our mother had dug. The math was already falling apart under basic scrutiny. The murmurs around the tables grew louder. Cousins I only saw at funerals were shaking their heads, glaring at me with open disgust. The jury had reached a guilty verdict without hearing a single word of defense. Valerie sensed the momentum shifting in her favor. She knew she had the crowd eating out of her palm. She stepped away from the projector screen and marched down the center aisle of the horseshoe table. The gravel crunched sharply beneath her designer heels. She stopped directly across from me. Her shadow fell over my untouched plate of food. She raised her hand holding the crisp legal document she had waved earlier. With a sharp flick of her wrist, she brought it down. The thick paper struck the mahogany table with a loud crack. It was a promissory note printed on official legal stationery. A blank signature line waited at the bottom. "Sign the paper," Abigail Valerie commanded. Her voice dropped the sweet southern veneer. It was cold, metallic, and final. "Sign it right now, or you walk out of those gates and leave this family forever." Valerie kept her manicured hand pressed flat against the new promissory note resting on the mahogany table. The gold pen glinted in the harsh afternoon light. She waited for my submission. When I simply stared back at her without reaching for the instrument, a flash of irritation tightened the corners of her mouth. Her carefully constructed facade of the wounded matriarch slipped for a fraction of a second, revealing the calculating predator beneath. She realized intimidation alone would not force my signature. She needed to deploy the ultimate leverage. Valerie stepped back, holding up the small black remote. She aimed it at the media console positioned near the catering tents. "If you want to pretend your memory is failing you, Abigail, then we will just have to refresh it," Valerie announced. Her tone shifted from mourning mother to triumphant prosecutor. "I kept the receipts. I kept all of them, including the agreements you made when you were old enough to understand the burden you placed on this household." She pressed the directional pad. The giant outdoor screen flickered. The spreadsheet vanished, replaced by a high-resolution scan of a single-aged document. It was a piece of standard printer paper, slightly yellowed at the edges. The heading at the top read, "Contract of Educational and Living Support Reimbursement." Below the title sat 3 paragraphs of dense legal jargon. The text explicitly stated that in exchange for continued shelter transportation and university tuition funding, the undersigned individual agreed to repay the maternal party in full upon reaching 30 years of age. At the very bottom of the scanned page, dated 12 years ago, sat a signature line. Resting right on that line, written in blue ink, was my full legal name. A collective gasp swept through the 50 assembled guests. The ice in the sweet tea glasses stopped clinking. The murmurs morphed into a rising tide of vocal condemnation. In Southern culture, family disputes are often dismissed as emotional misunderstandings, but a signed contract introduces a brutal, undeniable reality. American society bows to the sanctity of a signature. To the relatives sitting under the live oaks, that piece of paper was a smoking gun. It proved I was not merely an ungrateful daughter. It proved I was a legally bound debtor attempting to skip out on a written promise. Aunt Diane jolted upward from her seat near the centerpiece floral arrangement. She pointed a trembling finger at the glowing screen. "She signed it," Diane declared, her voice piercing the humid coastal air. "Look at the date. She was 18 years old. That is a binding legal contract, Abigail. You signed away your excuses 12 years ago. You owe your mother every single penny on that board." The tables erupted into a chorus of agreements. Uncle Richard nodded fiercely, crossing his arms over his chest. Cousins whispered to their spouses, pointing at the screen and shaking their heads. The trap had effectively closed around me. Valerie stood near the projection surface, soaking in the validation of her peers. She looked like a woman who had just checkmated her opponent in a grand tournament. The audience wanted to know how I would fight a signed contract. They waited for me to panic. They expected me to stammer, to claim I did not read what I signed, or to beg for a reduced settlement. I looked at the massive screen. I did not see a binding legal trap. I saw a crime scene. When you spend thousands of hours authenticating financial records, your brain stops reading words and starts analyzing geometric patterns. I focused intensely on the giant blue signature projected against the white canvas. My forensic training took over, isolating the microscopic details. I studied the capital A at the beginning of my name. The upward stroke lacked the fluid, unbroken momentum of a natural signature. There was a microscopic hesitation mark right at the apex of the loop. The pressure applied to the digital pen scan remained entirely uniform across the entire name. Human hands do not write with uniform pressure. We press harder on downward strokes and lighter on the upward sweeps. Then I looked at the alignment. The tail of the letter L dipped at a very specific, awkward angle. My pulse settled into a slow, rhythmic cadence. I recognized that signature. It was my handwriting, but I never signed a reimbursement contract. 12 years ago, I was working closing shifts at a local diner, desperately saving cash to escape this toxic ecosystem. I knew better than to sign my name to anything Valerie handed me. The signature on the screen was a trace job. It was an exact millimeter-perfect replica of the signature I used on a high school biology field trip permission slip during my senior year. Valerie kept meticulous files of all my old school documents stored in a heavy metal cabinet in her home office. She had simply found a clear signature, placed tracing paper over it, and manufactured a fraudulent legal document to corner me a decade later. She committed forgery to validate her extortion. The audacity was staggering. Valerie believed that because she held the social high ground, no one would dare question the authenticity of her evidence. She banked on the assumption that a scapegoated daughter would lack the psychological fortitude to challenge a printed contract in front of 50 angry witnesses. I did not scream fake. I did not yell forgery. If you accuse a narcissist of lying using a heightened emotional state, you lose the war immediately. They will instantly weaponize your anger. They will look at the crowd, shake their heads, and call you hysterical. They will claim your outburst is proof of your instability and guilt. A shouting match creates a fog of he said, she said, where the truth gets buried under theatrical drama. You do not win an argument with a narcissist using emotions. You win it using ledgers. You defeat them with cold, sterilized, undeniable data. I placed my linen napkin on the mahogany table. I smoothed the edges until it formed a perfect square. Then I stood up. The scrape of my wooden chair, pushing back against the stone patio, echoed loudly enough to silence the immediate vicinity. David shifted his weight, sliding his own chair back a fraction of an inch. It was a subtle defensive maneuver, positioning his broad shoulders to block anyone attempting to grab my arm. "Where do you think you are going?" Richard barked. He stood up, blocking the narrow pathway between the tables. "You sit back down and answer to your mother, Abigail. You are not walking away from a legal obligation." I looked at Richard. I did not blink. I did not offer an explanation. I simply stepped forward, forcing him to either physically assault me or move aside. Richard is a bully who operates exclusively on bluster. When faced with absolute silent conviction, he faltered. He sucked in his stomach and took a half step backward, allowing me to pass. I walked down the center aisle of the horseshoe arrangement. I ignored the glaring eyes of my aunts and the confused whispers of my cousins. I ignored Jessica, who was now staring at the forged document with a look of dawning horror, realizing her mother was escalating the situation into criminal territory. I bypassed Valerie entirely. She reached out as if to hand me the promissory note again, but I did not even break my stride. I walked straight toward the black media console, resting on a draped table near the projection screen. The system was running off a high-end smart tablet connected via a local wireless network. Valerie had left the main control interface unlocked, assuming her technological setup was secure. I pulled my personal smartphone from my dress pocket. I did not need to hack a password. I just needed proximity. My device was already loaded with the exact digital ammunition required to dismantle this illusion. I stood next to the console. The heat radiating from the projector bulb warmed my arm. 50 relatives held their collective breath, waiting to see what the disgraced daughter would do next. Valerie turned around, her triumphant smile faltering as she realized I was not fleeing the venue. I held my phone screen hovering directly over the smart console's synchronization sensor. I looked at the crowd. I tapped a single button to hijack the Bluetooth connection. My finger touched the glass screen of my smartphone. The smart console chimed a soft electronic tone acknowledging the new wireless pairing. The giant outdoor display behind Valerie flashed a brilliant stark white before plunging into pitch black. For a fraction of a second, the patio was bathed solely in the natural dappled shade of the live oak canopy. The abrupt transition stripped away the glowing spreadsheet and the forged signature. Valerie used that expensive high-definition lens to project a fabricated mythology. I planned to use the exact same light source to project an autopsy. The connection finalized. The screen illuminated again. It no longer displayed the carefully formatted presentation from her laptop. Instead, the display mirrored the interface of my personal device. The battery icon sat in the top right corner. A grid of my digital folders appeared scaled up to 10 feet tall. The low hum of the projector fan provided the only background noise. I did not raise my voice. I did not shout over the lingering murmurs. I spoke calmly into the sudden vacuum of sound. Audit complete. I tapped the screen, opening a folder labeled Historical Archives. I did not start my counterattack with the financial figures. If you attack the money first, a manipulator will argue about hidden expenses and unrecorded cash gifts. They will muddy the waters with abstract claims of generosity. You have to destroy their timeline. If the chronological timeline shatters, the entire financial foundation collapses alongside it. The first record materialized on the canvas. It was not a homemade contract printed on standard office paper. It was a dense, sterile government document. The header read Free Application for Federal Student Aid, dated my freshman year of college. I zoomed in, dragging my finger across my screen so the audience could read the specific highlighted boxes. Look at the expected family contribution line, I instructed the crowd. It clearly states $0. Now look at the dependency status box checked at the top right. A few relatives leaned forward, squinting in the bright coastal sunlight. The box marked independent was clearly filled. I did not pause to let them debate the nuances of student loans. I swiped to the next image before anyone could argue about financial aid loopholes. A heavy, ornate seal filled the display. It was a decree from the Mobile County Family Court. The language was dry, legal, and devastatingly clear. It granted full legal independence to a minor named Abigail. The date stamped at the bottom proved I was 17 years old when the judge signed the order. When you work in fraud investigation, you learn to digitize your entire life. You preserve every receipt, every tax return, and every legal decree. You build an impenetrable fortress of data because you know that human memory is flawed and toxic relatives love to rewrite history. I kept that court order on my phone for over a decade. I turned to face the 50 guests sitting at the banquet tables. I paid for my own existence, I said. My tone remained flat, devoid of the theatrical tears Valerie utilized moments ago. I left this house at 17. I petitioned a judge to sever Valerie from her legal rights over me so I could work full-time without her confiscating my paychecks. She did not provide shelter. She did not fund my tuition. She was legally and financially removed from my life before I even registered for university classes. I pointed at the screen. That forged contract she just showed you claims I agreed to repay her for college support. You cannot reimburse someone for a debt they never incurred. The murmuring died. The silence that followed was not expectant or tense. It was the heavy, suffocating quiet of a jury realizing they just convicted the wrong suspect. Dramatic irony flooded the courtyard. The aunts and cousins who condemned me mere seconds ago were now staring at federal watermarks and judicial signatures proving my innocence. They were staring at undeniable evidence that the matriarch of their family had just presented a fabricated document to extort her youngest daughter. Uncle Richard lowered his crystal tumbler. His brow furrowed in deep confusion as he tried to process the dense legal text. Aunt Diane pressed her lips together, unable to formulate a defense against a county judge's ruling. The visual of 50 people realizing they were duped was profound. The paper trail superseded Southern gossip. I watched Valerie closely. Her peach linen suit suddenly looked like a costume she wore to the wrong play. A tiny involuntary spasm tugged at the corner of her left eye. It was the physical manifestation of a predator losing control of the narrative. Her forged document was effectively incinerated by the bright light of verifiable data. The invoice for my childhood was debunked by the legal reality of my emancipation. Jessica sat frozen beside the head table. My sister stared at the court decree with wide, unblinking eyes. Perhaps she truly never knew the extent of my legal separation. Perhaps Valerie spun a tale about me running away and being ungrateful. Jessica's panic seemed to shift from fear of exposure to genuine shock. David remained seated, his posture relaxed but vigilant. He offered a single slow nod of approval. He knew the data was only the first phase of the operation. But a seasoned manipulator never surrenders when caught in a lie. They simply change the battlefield. Valerie recognized that the analytical route was a dead end. She could not win a paper war against an auditor. Her face shifted rapidly, abandoning the rigid indignation of a creditor. Her eyes widened, adopting a glossy, vulnerable sheen. Her shoulders slumped inward, transforming her posture from a dominant matriarch into a fragile, misunderstood martyr. The rigid set of her jaw softened into a quivering pout. She was preparing to launch the most potent weapon in her arsenal. If the data failed, she would drown the room in emotional distortion. She inhaled a shaky, ragged breath, gearing up to twist the facts into a narrative of maternal sacrifice. Valerie buried her face in her manicured hands. Her shoulders began to shake. The rigid, dominant posture she maintained for the last hour dissolved into a theatrical display of maternal grief. A single strangled sob escaped her lips, echoing across the silent patio. She lowered her hands, revealing eyes swimming in carefully produced tears. "I did it to protect her," Valerie wept. She looked around the horseshoe table, making desperate eye contact with the older relatives. Her voice pitched into a breathless, fragile register. "I forged that paper because I had to save my own daughter from herself. You all think she was just an independent teenager. You do not know the truth. She was drowning in secret debts. She associated with dangerous people. She was facing jail time for bad checks, and I spent my own savings covering her tracks so she would not ruin her future. I made that contract so she would eventually understand the gravity of what I sacrificed to keep her out of a prison cell." It was a masterful pivot. In a matter of seconds, she transformed a proven act of extortion into an act of heroic martyrdom. She wove a phantom narrative of juvenile delinquency that perfectly aligned with the rebellious runaway persona she had painted for me over the last decade. Aunt Diane stood up. She rushed to Valerie's side and wrapped an arm around her trembling shoulders. Diane glared at me with renewed venom. "A mother does whatever is necessary to protect her child," Diane announced to the viewing crowd. "Valerie shielded you from ruin, Abigail. She took on your burdens, and you repay her by humiliating her in front of her own family. You should be on your knees thanking this woman." I watched the tables react. The relatives who had just stared in horror at my emancipation documents were visibly relaxing. The tension in their shoulders eased. They wanted to believe Valerie. Believing her meant the established family hierarchy remained intact. Acknowledging that their matriarch was a calculating extortionist required tearing down the foundation of their entire social structure. It was far easier to swallow the lie of a troubled teenager and a self-sacrificing mother. Murmurs of sympathy for Valerie rippled through the sticky summer air. The sheer audacity of her fabrication triggered a visceral physical response deep inside my chest. My mind snapped backward, pulling me away from the sunlit coastal estate and dropping me into a sensory memory from 13 years ago. I was 17 years old, sitting in the financial aid office at the University of Alabama. The air conditioning in the administrative building blasted a frigid artificial chill that made my bare arms ache. I sat in a cheap molded plastic chair, gripping an acceptance letter and a printed budget. I had spent 3 years working closing shifts at a local diner, scrubbing grease off griddles until midnight to save for tuition. I deposited every minimum wage paycheck into a joint custodial savings account Valerie set up for me. The financial aid counselor, a tired woman with wire-rimmed glasses, turned her bulky computer monitor toward me. I expected to see my hard-earned diner wages ready to be applied to my freshman dorm fees. Instead, the digital ledger displayed a zero balance. The counselor offered a look of profound, uncomfortable pity. She gently explained that the custodial account had been systematically drained over the prior 18 months. The money I scrubbed floors to earn had been transferred directly into Valerie's primary checking account. Valerie did not save me from secret debts. She was the one who created them. She stole my escape fund to finance her own lifestyle, leaving me stranded in a freezing office with empty pockets. That moment in Tuscaloosa broke something fundamental inside me, but it also forged my future. Sitting in that cheap plastic chair, I realized that words are merely smoke. People will lie to your face while emptying your pockets. But currency is physical. Money leaves an undeniable chronological trail. My obsession with tracking stolen funds, tracking the very things people try to bury, was born in that cold room. The memory faded, replaced once again by the heavy humidity of Point Clear. I looked at the 50 faces judging me. I saw Uncle Richard nodding in agreement with Diane's defense. I saw Jessica looking relieved that the narrative had shifted away from the genuine financial rot. I looked down at David. My husband caught my gaze. He did not say a word, but the subtle tilt of his head communicated everything I needed to know. I realized in that instant that defending myself against a narcissist is a losing game. When you play defense, you agree to compete on their battlefield. You waste your energy swatting away ghost stories and imaginary grievances. If I stood there and tried to prove I never wrote a bad check, Valerie would simply invent a new phantom crime. She would keep the jury focused on my teenage years forever. I took a step away from the smart console. I walked back toward the center of the patio, placing myself equidistant from every watching relative. I refused to raise my voice to compete with Valerie's theatrical sobbing. True authority does not shout. I did not come to this estate to litigate my teenage years, I told the room. My voice cut through the ambient noise, carrying a cold, sterile weight. Valerie's fake tears hitched in her throat. She looked up at me, sensing the shift in my posture. I came here because my profession requires me to follow hidden assets, I continued. I spend my life auditing corrupt organizations. I find the money people try to make invisible. And recently my job intersected with my own family tree. I pointed to the massive outdoor screen. The emancipation document still glowed brightly against the canvas. I pulled my phone from my pocket and prepared to open a very different kind of digital folder. Valerie claims she spent hundreds of thousands of dollars keeping me out of trouble, I said. She claims she wants to be reimbursed for her maternal sacrifices. She put a very specific number on that board. I paused, letting the silence stretch out, forcing the crowd to lean in. The cicadas hummed in the distant oak branches. Do you want to know where the $412,750 really came from? I did not wait for an answer. I tapped the glass of my smartphone, sliding my thumb across the interface to open a heavily encrypted directory. The giant projector behind the head table obeyed the command. The court emancipation decree vanished. In its place, a dense multi-page spreadsheet materialized on the canvas. This was not a homemade invoice typed up in a basic word processor. This was a certified financial ledger bearing the official watermark of a major national bank. A federal subpoena stamp sat in the top right corner of the document, validating its authenticity. Before we dissect these columns, I need to share a brief piece of our shared heritage, I told the staring audience. I looked toward the older generation of relatives sitting near the magnolia centerpieces. You all remember my grandmother, Eleanor Harrison. When she passed away, she left behind a very specific financial safety net. She established the Harrison Family Irrevocable Trust. The language in that trust was ironclad. The funds were designated exclusively for the benefit of her two granddaughters, me and Jessica. I gestured toward my sister. Jessica flinched, sinking deeper into her wooden chair. Her knuckles remained white, grasping the edge of the table as if bracing for a physical impact. My mother was named the trustee, I continued. For those unfamiliar with estate law, a trustee is merely a custodian. They possess a strict fiduciary duty to manage the money for the beneficiaries. They cannot use a single dime for personal expenses. And because the trust was irrevocable, the assets were legally walled off from Valerie's own creditors or personal whims. Aunt Diane frowned, her defense of Valerie faltering in the face of legal definitions. Uncle Richard shifted his weight, his bourbon glass resting forgotten on the white linen tablecloth. Beneficiaries of an irrevocable trust are legally entitled to receive annual financial statements. I explained. You are supposed to know exactly how your money is being managed, but I never received a single piece of mail regarding the Harrison estate. For over a decade, I assumed the account was negligible or tied up in slow-yielding bonds. I never asked about it because I built my own wealth. I paced a few steps across the stone patio, letting the gravel crunch beneath my shoes. But a forensic accountant develops certain involuntary habits. We do not trust surface-level perfection. A month ago, Jessica closed on her beautiful new luxury home in the historic district. I glanced at my sister again. Her breathing grew shallow. I ran a quiet routine background check on the mortgage filings. It is public record, and tracking real estate transactions is a fundamental part of my daily corporate routine. I was merely curious to see who underwrote the loan, but when I reviewed the digital wire transfer data for her down payment, my software flagged an anomaly. The routing number attached to the origin account did not belong to Jessica's personal bank. It belonged to the Harrison Family Irrevocable Trust. Valerie let out a sharp, breathless gasp. Her hands dropped to her sides. The peach linen suit she wore seemed to swallow her shrinking frame. That routing number sparked an audit, I told the silent crowd. I pulled the historical filings. I discovered why I never received my annual statements. Every single year, Valerie forged my signature on a legal waiver, effectively declining my right to review the ledger. She kept me blindfolded while she held the keys to the vault. I turned back to the smart console. I expanded the image on the outdoor screen, zooming in on the dense rows of withdrawals. Let us look at the subpoenaed bank records, I instructed. The relatives leaned forward. The older aunts pulled their reading glasses from their purses. The cousins squinted at the high-definition display. The columns told a brutal chronological story. Month after month, year after year, large sums of cash bled out of the custodial account. There were wire transfers to shell companies' cash withdrawals and cashier checks drawn against the principal balance. The visual evidence of systemic theft stretched across the canvas in undeniable black and white ink. I scrolled down to the final page of the bank statement. I highlighted the terminal balance field right at the bottom edge of the screen. "Look at the final deficit," I said, my voice dropping to a low, steady cadence. "Look at the exact amount of money missing from the Harrison Trust." The number glowed in bright, stark contrast to the white background. $412,750. A collective shudder ran through the 50 assembled guests. The realization hit the courtyard like a physical shockwave. The puzzle pieces snapped into a cohesive, terrifying picture. The fabricated invoice Valerie presented 10 minutes ago was not an arbitrary calculation of childhood piano lessons and emotional labor. It was a precise mirror image of the stolen funds. "She did not send me a bill for raising me," I stated. "She handed me a receipt for her theft." I stepped closer to Valerie. She could not look me in the eye. She stared at the stone patio, her chest heaving in erratic, panicked rhythms. "You might wonder why she staged this elaborate theatrical ambush today," I asked the audience. "Why rent this expensive coastal estate? Why invite 50 relatives to witness a family dispute?" I pointed at the forged promissory note still resting on the mahogany table. "Because I turned 30 years old last month," I explained. "According to my grandmother's estate bylaws, my 30th birthday triggers a mandatory independent legal audit of the trust before the final disbursement. The lawyers are scheduled to review the accounts next Tuesday. Valerie is out of time. She is cornered." I picked up the gold Mont Blanc pen she had tried to force into my hand. I held it up for the crowd to see. "She needed me to sign this fake loan agreement today," I said. "She planned to take this piece of paper to the estate lawyers next week and claim the trust was empty because I borrowed my own inheritance to repay her for my teenage expenses. She designed this entire family reunion to pressure me into signing a confession for a debt I did not owe so she could cover up her own embezzlement." The humid Alabama air grew instantly frigid. The atmosphere shifted from a scandalous Southern family squabble into a chilling federal crime scene. The aunts and uncles who previously nodded along with Valerie's guilt trip now stared at her with open revulsion. The woman they viewed as their generous matriarch was exposed as a desperate thief willing to sacrifice her youngest daughter to save herself. The gravity of the phrase felony embezzlement settled over the patio. The penalty for stealing nearly $500,000 from a custodial trust carried severe mandatory prison sentences. Valerie was not fighting for an apology anymore. She was fighting for her freedom. And when a cornered predator realizes their deception has failed, they do not surrender gracefully. They resort to brute force. Uncle Richard, realizing his own financial lifeline was about to be scrutinized under a federal microscope, let out a guttural shout. He shoved his heavy wooden chair backward, knocking it to the ground. His face contorted in a mask of pure, desperate rage. He lunged across the narrow space separating the tables, his hands reaching violently toward the media console, intent on destroying the digital evidence before it could ruin him too. The heavy wooden chair crashed against the stone flagstones, echoing like a gunshot across the quiet patio. Uncle Richard thrust himself upward, his face flushed a deep mottled crimson. The realization that federal authorities might scrutinize the family finances triggered a raw, primitive panic inside him. He did not care about the optics anymore. He needed to plunge the courtyard into darkness. He needed to sever the digital connection, broadcasting those bank records to 50 staring relatives. He lunged across the narrow walkway separating the banquet tables from the projection equipment. His heavy leather shoes dug into the gravel, sending small pebbles skittering into the manicured grass. His arms reached outward, aiming directly for the thick black power cord connecting the smart console to the wall outlet. He operated on the brute force logic of a cornered animal, believing that if he killed the light, he could kill the truth. David moved. "My husband does not posture. He does not shout or puff out his chest. Years of building custom cabinetry taught him how to assess structural weak points and how to brace against sudden shifting weight. He closed the distance between his chair and the media console in 2 silent, measured strides. He planted his work boots onto the flagstone, squaring his broad shoulders. He did not raise his fists. He simply became an immovable object, occupying the exact space Richard needed to cross. Richard collided with David's chest. The older man bounced backward, his momentum entirely halted by the solid wall of muscle standing in his path. Richard stumbled, catching his balance against the edge of a catering table, causing a tower of empty crystal glasses to rattle precariously. "Move!" Richard spat, his voice trembling with exertion and fear. "She has no right to show those documents. You are helping her destroy this family." David folded his arms across his chest. He looked down at the older man, his expression entirely devoid of anger. "Let her finish," David said. The command was spoken at a normal conversational volume, but it carried the unyielding density of iron. Richard glared at him, breathing heavily through his nose, but he did not attempt a second charge. The physical route was blocked. Denied access to the power cord, Richard pivoted back to the only weapon he had left. He tried to rally the crowd. "You are a destructive force!" Abigail, Richard yelled, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You bring this garbage to a family celebration. You disrespect the woman who put a roof over your head. You are tearing a legacy apart over a misunderstanding." I watched his desperate performance. Toxic family systems always contain an enabler like Richard. They are the loud, aggressive guard dogs who attack anyone questioning the reigning matriarch. From the outside, their fierce loyalty looks like devotion. But a forensic accountant knows that loyalty in a corrupt system is rarely fueled by love. It is almost always fueled by complicity. The guard dog bites because he is eating scraps from the thieves' table. I did not raise my voice to match his shouting. I did not argue about respect or legacy. I lowered my gaze to my smartphone screen. I slid my thumb to the left. The projector obeyed. The dense multi-page bank ledger detailing the trust deficit vanished from the massive outdoor display. A new solitary document illuminated the canvas. It was a single wire transfer confirmation receipt retrieved directly from the clearinghouse records. The bright white light cast long shadows across the faces of the relatives sitting in the front row. "Sit down, Richard," I said. My voice sliced through the humid coastal air carrying the sterile chill of an operating room. "Sit down before I show them your consulting fees." The words acted like a physical blow. Richard's outstretched arm dropped to his side. The deep crimson flush drained from his cheeks, leaving his skin a pale, sickly gray. He stared at the glowing screen, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. I zoomed in on the projected receipt, ensuring the text was legible to every person sitting at the horseshoe tables. "Let us review the accounting," I instructed the silent courtyard. 3 years ago, Gulf Coast Marine Supply faced imminent bankruptcy. Your business was drowning, Richard. You defaulted on 2 commercial loans and the bank prepared to seize your inventory. Then a miraculous financial intervention occurred. Valerie stepped in and offered you a private lifeline. She told the family she dipped into her own retirement savings out of the goodness of her heart to save her brother's livelihood. I pointed to the digital receipt on the screen. "Look at the origin routing number," I said. The relatives leaned forward, reading the sequence of digits. It matched the exact routing number of the Harrison Family Irrevocable Trust I had displayed mere moments ago. "Now look at the destination account," I continued. It listed the primary operating account for Gulf Coast Marine Supply. "And finally, look at the amount and the memo line," I told the crowd. The figure glowed in harsh, undeniable contrast. $65,000. The memo line authorized by Valerie's signature read consulting fees. "She did not save your business with her retirement funds," Richard said, looking directly into his terrified eyes. "She used my inheritance to pay off your commercial debts, and she categorized it as a consulting fee to bypass the daily transfer limits. She bought your loyalty with stolen cash. That is why you stand up and shout whenever someone questions her authority. You are not protecting your sister. You are protecting your co-conspirator." Richard took a slow, trembling step backward. His knees buckled slightly, and he slumped heavily into the nearest empty chair. He buried his face in his hands, hiding from the burning stares of the cousins and aunts seated around him. The blustering, aggressive patriarch persona melted away, leaving nothing but a compromised, broken man facing federal exposure. The physical threat evaporated entirely. The atmosphere on the patio transitioned from heated outrage into a state of cold, paralyzing terror. The 50 guests sitting under the live oaks suddenly realized the true scope of the situation. This was not a contained dispute between a mother and a daughter. I was not just holding Valerie's financial history hostage on that screen. I held all of them. Every relative who had ever accepted a generous cash gift from Valerie, every aunt who received a sudden loan to fix a leaking roof, every cousin whose wedding was partially funded by the matriarch suddenly felt the icy grip of panic. They mentally calculated their own liabilities. They wondered if their names were hiding inside the encrypted folders on my smartphone. The social hierarchy of the family shattered in real time. Valerie derived her power by acting as the generous benefactor dispensing favors and demanding absolute obedience in return. I just proved her generosity was financed by embezzlement. She was distributing stolen goods. Aunt Diane, who had vigorously defended Valerie just minutes prior, slowly inched her chair away from the head table. She created physical distance between herself and her sister. The collective loyalty of the group dissolved, replaced by the primal instinct of self-preservation. No one wanted to be caught in the blast radius of a federal audit. Valerie stood frozen near the edge of the stone terrace. She looked at Richard slouched in his chair, and then looked at the surrounding relatives. She saw them pulling away, averting their eyes, refusing to offer her a single word of support. The army she had assembled to humiliate me was currently praying I would not turn the digital spotlight on them next. I stood beside the media console, my thumb resting lightly on the glass surface of my phone. I commanded the room without raising my heart rate. I had weaponized their own hidden greed and turned their silent complicity into a trap. I looked down the long expanse of the banquet tables, making deliberate eye contact with the aunts, uncles, and cousins. I let the silence hang over the water, allowing the fear to fully marinate in their minds. "Does anyone else want to discuss my teenage expenses?" I asked, "or would you rather see the rest of the ledger?" Nobody answered my question. The 50 guests sat paralyzed under the sprawling live oaks. I held their collective reputations in the palm of my hand. I did not care about exposing minor loans or petty cash gifts given to distant cousins. My target was the primary architect of the theft. I tapped the glass interface of my phone, returning the display to the master financial spreadsheet. "Let us examine how a matriarch builds an empire," I suggested. I set the display to scroll at a steady, readable pace. The columns of text rolled upward on the giant outdoor screen, projecting a relentless chronological history of greed. The bright white light of the projector cut through the thick, humid air of the Alabama afternoon. I highlighted specific clusters of transactions, coloring the rows in a stark, undeniable yellow. "Observe the transportation expenses," I said, my voice projecting evenly over the rhythmic humming of the patio fans. $40,000 drained over a span of 36 months. Those funds went directly to a premium auto dealership in downtown Mobile. I let the audience read the merchant names and the dates. Valerie always claimed her pristine luxury SUVs were the hard-earned reward for her tireless dedication to her real estate career. She drove those vehicles to family gatherings and church functions, projecting an aura of unmatched financial stability. The records indicated a different reality. She financed her depreciating status symbols using my grandmother's estate. She literally drove her daughter's inheritance into the ground. I swiped again, bringing a new cluster into focus. $55,000 sent to international travel agencies and luxury hospitality conglomerates. The crowd stared at the itemized list of transatlantic flights and premium hotel bookings. "You all remember her month-long excursions to the Amalfi Coast and the French Riviera," I reminded the viewing relatives. She sent postcards detailing the lavish vineyard tours and private boat charters. She framed those trips as the well-deserved retreats of a highly successful businesswoman. She sat at your dinner tables and recounted the beauty of Mediterranean sunsets. She paid for those sunsets by siphoning cash from a custodial account meant to secure my future. The relatives watched the screen in morbid fascination. They were witnessing the live autopsy of a manufactured identity. Valerie did not earn her wealth. She wore it like a stolen costume. She purchased the respect of her peers using stolen currency, and the most damning piece of that costume was currently glittering in the afternoon light. I stopped the scrolling ledger. I isolated a single solitary line item from 2 years ago. I enlarged the text until the merchant name and the exact dollar amount dominated the canvas. $18,000 wired directly to a Tiffany & Company corporate account. I lowered my smartphone, letting my arm drop to my side. I turned my body to face my mother. She stood rigid near the edge of the stone terrace. Throughout the entire luncheon, she had utilized a very specific physical gesture. Whenever she reached for her crystal champagne flute or brushed a stray blonde hair from her forehead, she ensured her left hand caught the sunlight. She wanted the audience to notice the heavy diamond tennis bracelet encircling her wrist. It was a thick band of flawless stones, a physical testament to her supposed prosperity. She wore it like a crown. I raised my hand and pointed directly at her left arm. "Take a close look at the jewelry she is wearing today," I told the silent courtyard. Every head pivoted. Dozens of eyes locked onto Valerie's wrist. The thick cluster of diamonds caught the harsh coastal sun, refracting sharp shards of light across the peach linen of her tailored suit. The stones sparkled with an icy brilliance contrasting sharply against the humid tropical environment. "That bracelet is not a family heirloom," I stated, my tone devoid of inflection. "It is not the byproduct of a lucrative property commission. It is an $18,000 piece of stolen property. She bought those diamonds using the very trust fund she swore to protect." The revulsion in the air became a tangible force. Dramatic irony clamped down on the guests. The aunts and cousins who had complimented that exact piece of jewelry earlier in the afternoon now stared at it with profound disgust. They realized Valerie was parading her felony in front of their faces, expecting them to applaud her success. The psychological calculation required to wear stolen gems while simultaneously extorting the victim of that theft defied basic human decency. It bordered on the sociopathic. She stood at the head of a banquet table, demanding I pay her $400,000 for the burden of my childhood, while wearing my inheritance on her wrist. Valerie recoiled. The confident, venomous matriarch vanished entirely. Her left hand spasmed. She yanked her arm backward, tucking her wrist tight against the small of her back, attempting to hide the glittering evidence from the judging stares. Her posture crumpled. The physical retreat mirrored her collapsing authority. She tried to open her mouth to offer an excuse or a distraction, but her voice failed her. The raw data stripped away her ability to manipulate the narrative. She could not gaslight a bank routing number. The patio remained dead quiet, save for the distant cry of a coastal gull circling Mobile Bay. I watched my mother shrink into herself. For a fleeting second I felt the ghost of a daughter mourning the parent she never truly possessed. But a forensic accountant does not halt an audit because the subject looks pathetic. An incomplete investigation is merely a cover-up in progress. The cars, the vacations, and the diamonds explain a significant portion of the deficit, I told the crowd. But they do not account for the entirety of the missing $500,000. I raised my phone again. I looked away from the broken woman standing on the terrace and shifted my focus to the chair sitting immediately to her right. Jessica. My sister sat rigidly in her designer silk wrap dress. The faint sheen of sweat I noticed earlier had bloomed into visible drops gliding down her pale temples. She stared at the blank space on the mahogany table in front of her, refusing to make eye contact with me or anyone else in the vicinity. Her flawless golden child facade was fracturing under the immense pressure of the looming revelation. I tapped the screen. I swiped past the jewelry receipts and the luxury travel itineraries. I bypassed the minor withdrawals and the petty cash transfers. I pulled up the final encrypted folder. "We have examined the vanity purchases," I announced. "Now we must examine the ultimate betrayal, the largest single block of missing money." I commanded the projector to display the next slide. A staggering six-figure wire transfer illuminated the canvas, casting a harsh white glow over Jessica's hunched shoulders. I watched my sister's breath hitch. Her chest froze mid-inhalation. She knew exactly what numbers were about to appear behind her. The giant outdoor display shifted, loading the next piece of evidence. The dense grid of minor transactions faded. A single isolated wire transfer filled the vast white canvas. I magnified the specific row until the stark black text was impossible to ignore. The bright projection cut through the humid afternoon shadows, casting a pale glow across the stunned faces of my relatives. I directed my gaze toward my older sister. Jessica sat frozen, her manicured fingernails digging into the edge of the mahogany banquet table. "This transaction occurred precisely 3 years and 2 months ago," I announced. My voice remained even, carrying over the gentle rustle of the live oak branches overhead. "Look at the exact figure on the screen." The number sat isolated in the center of the display. $120,000. "Now look at the memo line authorized by the trustee," I instructed. The text read, "Down payment, Jessica Historic District property." A sharp collective intake of breath swept through the courtyard. The ice in the crystal water glasses shifted as 50 guests physically reacted to the revelation. The magnitude of the theft took on a new, deeply personal dimension. Valerie did not just steal my inheritance to fund her own lavish lifestyle. She stole my future to subsidize my sister's perfect image. Jessica stood up so fast, her heavy wooden chair tipped backward and clattered against the stone flagstones. She stumbled forward, her knees trembling beneath her designer silk dress. She grabbed the edge of the table to steady herself, her knuckles turning a stark bone white. "No!" Jessica gasped, her voice cracking into a high-pitched register of pure panic. "No, that is not true." She looked around this horseshoe arrangement, desperately seeking a friendly face. Her eyes darted from Uncle Richard to Aunt Diane and finally landed on me. The flawless, confident persona of the successful real estate broker vanished. She looked like a terrified child trapped in a lie she could not comprehend. I did not know Jessica wept. The tears spilled over her eyelashes, ruining her expensive makeup and leaving dark streaks down her pale cheeks. "I swear to you, Abby, I did not know where that money came from." She pressed a hand over her mouth, her chest heaving with erratic sobs. She played the role of the devastated, oblivious victim with total conviction. "Mom told me she had a record-breaking year at the brokerage," Jessica cried, directing her defense to the watching audience. "She told me she closed 3 commercial properties and wanted to share her success. She said she wanted to help me establish roots in a safe neighborhood for my children. She told me it was a gift, a maternal gift from her own savings. I never would have taken it if I knew it belonged to you." The relatives watching this display felt a sudden, profound wave of pity. The anger they directed at Valerie a moment ago softened as they witnessed Jessica's apparent heartbreak. They saw a woman whose entire beautiful life was suddenly exposed as a hollow lie built on stolen currency. They believed Jessica was just another casualty of our mother's deception, an innocent bystander caught in the crossfire of a financial crime. I watched my sister perform her grief. I did not raise my voice. I did not offer anger or resentment. "She did not give you a gift, Jess," I said softly. My tone held no malice, only cold, analytical truth. "A gift implies generosity without conditions. She stole my inheritance to buy your loyalty." Jessica squeezed her eyes shut, shaking her head as if trying to physically eject my words from her mind. The tragedy of the golden child is a complex psychological snare. Toxic parents do not elevate a favored sibling out of genuine unconditional love. They elevate them because the golden child is malleable. Valerie recognized early on that Jessica craved approval and comfort. By funding Jessica's pristine lifestyle, Valerie purchased a permanent ally. She bought an indebted servant who would always defend her, who would always praise her, and who would always stand by her side during family disputes. Jessica traded her autonomy for a luxury down payment. Her golden cage was financed by my stolen trust fund. Valerie rushed forward, her peach linen heels clicking sharply against the gravel. She wrapped her arms tightly around Jessica's trembling shoulders, pulling her favored daughter into a fierce, protective embrace. "I did it for you, sweetheart," Valerie whispered loudly enough for the front row of relatives to hear. "I wanted you to have a beautiful home. I wanted my grandchildren to have a sprawling backyard in the best school district. I sacrificed my own peace of mind to give your family the foundation you deserved." Valerie rested her chin against Jessica's hair, closing her eyes in a portrait of tragic maternal devotion. She was trying to salvage the narrative. She framed her federal embezzlement as a noble martyrdom undertaken for the sake of her grandchildren. The courtyard fell into a heavy, somber silence. Aunt Diane pressed a tissue to her eyes, deeply moved by the theatrical display of a mother comforting her broken daughter. The guests seemed to collectively decide that this was the natural emotional climax of the afternoon. The scapegoat had revealed the painful truth. The guilty matriarch was exposed. The innocent sister was devastated. It felt like the final curtain falling on a tragic Southern play. They expected me to pack up my smartphone and walk away. They expected me to leave Jessica to mourn her shattered reality, while Valerie faced the quiet judgment of her peers. But I am a forensic accountant. I do not deal in emotional climaxes or convenient ignorance. I looked at the 2 women clinging to each other near the edge of the stone terrace. I observed the tears and the trembling shoulders. To the untrained eye, it was a picture of devastating betrayal. But my eyes are trained to see the structural logic beneath the surface. Data leaves no room for innocent bystanders. I considered Jessica's professional credentials. My sister holds a highly competitive real estate license. She operates a boutique brokerage handling multi-million-dollar property transactions every single day. She understands the stringent federal lending laws governing residential mortgages. She knows exactly how bank underwriters verify funds before approving a luxury home loan. When a home buyer receives a six-figure cash injection for a down payment, the lending bank requires a mountain of paperwork. They require certified gift letters. They trace the origin of the funds to ensure the money is not derived from illicit activities. They demand to see the routing numbers and the account statements verifying where the cash originated. A seasoned real estate broker closing on her own personal home does not blindly accept a wire transfer without seeing the origination documents. Jessica would have personally reviewed the closing disclosures. She would have seen the name of the Harrison Family Irrevocable Trust printed in black and white ink on her settlement statement. Ignorance is a luxury reserved for those who do not read the fine print. And Jessica always read the fine print. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone again. The glass felt cool and familiar against my palm. I unlocked the screen, navigating away from the bank ledgers. I bypassed the financial spreadsheets entirely and opened a specific digital folder containing communication records. The narrative of the innocent weeping sister was a beautiful fiction. It was time to introduce the reality of complicity. I prepared to drop the final devastating truth onto the projection screen. I did not reach out to comfort my older sister. I did not offer a soothing platitude or a forgiving embrace. The illusion of the heartbroken victim was a compelling performance, but my profession demands a rigorous dedication to the raw evidence. And the evidence sitting in my digital archives painted a far more sinister portrait of the woman weeping on the stone terrace. I swiped my thumb across the glass interface of my smartphone. The giant outdoor projector responded instantly. The devastating six-figure wire transfer faded into the digital ether. In its place, a standard email inbox materialized on the sprawling white canvas. The stark layout of the communication software contrasted sharply with the emotional theater playing out near the head table. I magnified the screen, focusing the bright projection on a single specific thread of correspondence. The dates attached to the messages were not pulled from years ago. They were recent. The timestamps indicated the emails were exchanged a mere 21 days prior to this afternoon luncheon. "Let us examine the anatomy of an ambush," I announced. My voice carried a sterile surgical precision, cutting through Jessica's theatrical sobs. The relatives sitting around the horseshoe arrangement blinked in confusion. They squinted at the high-definition display, trying to decipher the blocks of text. I dragged my finger across my phone, highlighting the sender and recipient fields. The sender listed on every single message was Jessica's primary business email address. The recipient was our mother. A month ago, Jessica attempted to refinance her beautiful historic district property to secure a lower interest rate, I explained to the captivated audience. Refinancing a luxury home requires a rigorous underwriting process. The bank examiners dig deep into the original purchase documents to verify equity and ownership history. During that routine review, an underwriter noticed an irregularity regarding her initial down payment. They flagged the Harrison Trust routing number and asked for clarification. I paused, letting the structural reality of the real estate industry settle over the courtyard. That inquiry triggered a panic, I continued. Jessica realized the origin of her down payment was no longer buried in the past. It was sitting on a loan officer's desk. She also knew my 30th birthday was rapidly approaching. She understood the legal mechanisms of the estate. She knew the lawyers were legally obligated to audit the ledger next week. I turned my gaze toward the two women standing near the magnolia centerpieces. When my sister discovered her perfect life was financed by stolen currency, she did not cry, I stated. She did not call me to apologize. She did not demand our mother confess to the authorities. She strategized. She calculated the risk of losing her property and decided my future was an acceptable casualty. I pointed to the first highlighted email on the massive screen. I read the text aloud, ensuring every syllable reached the furthest corners of the patio. "Mom, the examiner flagged the trust account," Jessica wrote. Her words hung in the humid Alabama air, stripped of any sisterly affection. "Abigail reaches the milestone age next month. If the estate attorneys review the ledger, my home will be seized as an asset purchased with embezzled funds. We have a narrow window to fix this before the audit." The weeping on the terrace ceased. Jessica's erratic sobs cut off as if a physical switch had been flipped inside her chest. The tears vanished. Her hunched, fragile posture evaporated. She stood up straight, her spine rigid, her facial muscles frozen in a mask of sheer, unadulterated guilt. The biological response of a predator caught in a snare replaced the gentle facade of the wounded sibling. I scrolled down to the next message in the thread. This email was sent a day later, containing detailed bullet points and logistical instructions. "We must corner her," Jessica wrote, drafting the blueprint for my execution. "She cares about public decorum. She will not cause a scene if we surround her with an audience. Rent the waterfront estate in Point Clear. Invite the entire extended family. Make it a grand spectacle so she feels socially trapped. I will write a script for you to deliver during the toast. We just need her signature on a retroactive loan agreement to satisfy the estate lawyers and clear my title." The double betrayal hit the courtyard like a physical shockwave. The relatives who had just offered Jessica their profound sympathy now recoiled in visible horror. The revelation incinerated the golden child illusion, leaving nothing but a calculating extorter standing in the ashes. Jessica did not just know about the theft. She was the primary architect of today. She designed the seating chart to box me in. She selected the upscale venue knowing the unspoken rules of Southern hospitality would pressure me into silence. She wrote the words Valerie read aloud during the toast. She fabricated the concept of the emotional invoice. My own sister calculated the exact emotional pressure points required to break my spirit and steal my inheritance for a second time. She was willing to let me shoulder a fake $500,000 debt for the rest of my life just to protect the equity in her real estate. The physical reaction of the guests was immediate and profound. Aunt Diane, who had previously rushed to defend the matriarch, actually pushed her chair backward, scraping the wooden legs across the stone. She put physical distance between herself and her nieces. Uncle Richard stared at the ground, refusing to look at anyone. The disgust in the air was palpable. The family realized they were not merely invited to a reunion. They were summoned to act as unwitting accomplices in a coordinated financial shakedown orchestrated by the two women they respected most. Valerie dropped her arms. The protective embrace she maintained around her favored daughter fell away. The mother and the golden child stood side by side, but the chasm between them was vast. Their mutual conspiracy was laid bare under the unforgiving light of the projector. There was no loyalty between thieves, only a shared desperation to avoid the consequences of their actions. I looked at my older sister. I studied the woman who shared my childhood, the woman who attended my wedding, the woman who smiled in family photographs while quietly planning my ruin. "You priced your soul at $120,000, Jess," I said. My voice did not waver. I hoped the square footage was worth it. Jessica could not maintain eye contact. Her knees buckled under the crushing weight of public humiliation. She collapsed heavily into her chair. She crossed her arms tightly over her stomach, curling inward, as if trying to shrink away from the burning judgment radiating from the 50 relatives. She offered no defense. The digital footprint she left behind was flawless. The emails proved her malice beyond a reasonable doubt. She was ruined. Her reputation, her career, and her standing in the family were permanently destroyed by her own written words. David shifted his stance beside me. He let out a slow, measured breath, a silent acknowledgement of the devastation unfolding on the patio. The surgical removal of the cancer was nearly complete, but a cornered animal is a dangerous entity. Valerie watched her favored daughter crumble. She watched her loyal enablers pull away in disgust. She realized her social empire was reduced to rubble, and her financial crimes were backed by undeniable proof. Stripped of her allies, her fake invoices, and her maternal authority, she had nothing left to lose. The initial panic that clouded Valerie's eyes hardened into something far more volatile. A dark, vicious desperation took root in her posture. She straightened her peach linen suit, squaring her shoulders toward me. If she was going to fall, she intended to inflict maximum collateral damage on the way down. She reached into the deepest, most toxic reserve of her power, preparing to launch a retaliatory strike that defied all logic and reason. Valerie did not retreat. She did not collapse into a chair like Jessica, or hide her face like Richard. When the final layer of her deception burned away, exposing the dark, cynical core of her character, she did not apologize. She weaponized her exposure. Stripped of the protective armor of the grieving matriarch, she embraced the raw, unchecked authority she held over the bloodline. Her posture shifted, abandoning the fragile, wounded stance she maintained earlier. She planted her designer heels firmly on the stone flagstones. She raised her chin, her eyes narrowing into cold, calculating slits. A sharp, bitter laugh escaped her throat. The sound was harsh and metallic, cutting through the lingering shock of the exposed email thread. "You really think a digital presentation changes the hierarchy of this family?" Valerie asked, her voice rising in volume and intensity. You think parading a few bank ledgers on a screen suddenly makes you the authority figure here, Abigail. She took a deliberate step toward me. The relatives seated in the front rows instinctively leaned backward, giving her a wide berth. The atmosphere on the patio transitioned from a scandalous exposure to a tense standoff. Spreadsheets do not govern the real world, Valerie declared, her voice echoing over the quiet waters of Mobile Bay. Documents and routing numbers are just paper. They mean absolutely nothing when confronted with actual structural power. And I am the structural power in this family. I hold the keys to the entire kingdom. The venom in her tone was startling. She was pivoting away from defense and launching a scorched earth offensive. She realized she could not debate the facts, so she decided to threaten the foundation of our entire ecosystem. Valerie possessed a unique legal stranglehold over the extended family. My grandfather, William Harrison, was the patriarch of our lineage. He suffered a severe stroke 3 years ago, leaving him partially paralyzed and heavily reliant on specialized medical care. At the time, Valerie maneuvered herself into the primary caregiver role. She did not do it out of filial devotion. She did it to consolidate control. "I am the sole executor of your grandfather's broader estate," Valerie yelled, pointing a manicured finger toward the sky. "I possess the primary medical power of attorney. I dictate the terms of his care. I control the distribution of his remaining assets. I command the legal mechanisms that govern the survival of this bloodline." She leveled a terrifying glare at me. "If you attempt to bring those trust documents to the federal authorities, I will unleash a legal nightmare that will consume the next decade of your life," Valerie threatened. "I will tie the estate up in probate court until the legal fees bankrupt you. I will hire the most aggressive defense attorneys in the state, and I will pay their retainers using your grandfather's liquid assets. By the time a judge issues a final ruling, there will not be a single dollar left for you to inherit." The threat was not an empty boast. The American legal system is a labyrinth. A motivated executor holding power of attorney can manufacture endless delays, file frivolous motions, and bleed an estate dry through protracted litigation. They can weaponize the courts, turning the pursuit of justice into a financial war of attrition. Valerie was banking on the terrifying reality that the sheer cost of fighting her would force me into a silent retreat. But she was not finished. A true manipulator understands that financial threats are often insufficient to break a principled opponent. They must threaten the vulnerable. They must hold a hostage. Valerie turned her attention away from me and swept her gaze across the horrified faces of the 50 guests. "And if anyone sitting at these tables attempts to support Abigail in this crusade," Valerie announced, her voice dripping with malice, "I will exercise my medical authority tomorrow morning. I will discharge William from his private assisted living facility. I will place him in the cheapest understaffed state-run nursing home I can find. He will spend his final years in a sterile, forgotten ward, and I will legally bar every single one of you from visiting him." A collective gasp of genuine horror erupted from the aunts and uncles. The financial extortion was scandalous, but threatening the health and safety of the elderly patriarch crossed a profound moral boundary. Aunt Diane pressed a hand over her mouth, stifling a sob. Uncle Richard stared at Valerie as if looking at a stranger. The cruelty was absolute and unyielding. Valerie was holding her own father hostage to secure her immunity. She was betting that my moral compass would prevent me from sacrificing my grandfather to a state-run facility. She assumed I would absorb the financial loss of the stolen trust fund to guarantee his continued comfort. It was a flawless sociopathic calculation. She orchestrated a scenario of mutually assured destruction. If I detonated the financial truth, she would detonate the physical safety of the family patriarch. The relatives looked away from Valerie, intimidated by the sheer scale of her retaliation. The courage they briefly found when reviewing the bank ledgers evaporated. The fear of probate court and elder abuse paralyzed them. They realized that opposing Valerie meant inviting chaos and ruin into their own lives. They returned to their silent complicity, terrified of the consequences. The tension stretched tight enough to snap. The listener was left staring into a void of high anxiety, wondering if the digital evidence was truly enough to dismantle a woman who held absolute legal dominion over the vulnerable. Did Valerie still retain the unchecked power to ruin my future and destroy my grandfather? Was the paper trail meaningless in the face of medical power of attorney? Valerie absorbed the terrified silence of the courtyard. She watched the relatives avert their eyes and lower their heads in submission. She interpreted their fear as a total victory. She crossed her arms over her peach linen suit, resting her weight on one hip. A slow, triumphant smirk spread across her face. The panic that previously clouded her eyes vanished, replaced by a wicked, untouchable arrogance. She believed she had successfully checkmated me. She believed her nuclear threat effectively neutralized my forensic audit. She stood on the stone terrace, reigning over a captive audience, confident that her empire was secure. But a forensic accountant never enters a hostile negotiation without verifying the chain of custody. And Valerie made a critical tactical error. She assumed her legal dominion was permanent. She assumed the patriarch was a silent, helpless pawn in her game. Before I could open my mouth to respond to her extortion, the rhythmic sound of a heavy wooden cane striking the stone flagstones broke the silence. The slow, deliberate cadence echoed across the patio, drawing the attention of every single guest. The sound originated from the far end of the head table. A chair scraped backward, pushed with significant effort. A figure slowly rose from the shadows of the live oak canopy, preparing to shatter Valerie's illusion of absolute control. The rhythmic strike of the wooden cane commanded the attention of the courtyard. The sound was deliberate, cutting through the suffocating tension Valerie engineered. At the far end of the head table, sitting beneath the deepest shade of the live oaks, my grandfather William Harrison pushed himself upward. He moved with agonizing slowness, his left side visibly stiffened by the lingering effects of his stroke. He gripped the edge of the mahogany table for balance, his knuckles mirroring the pale color of his cotton dress shirt. The 50 guests watched him in stunned silence. They expected the patriarch to intervene on behalf of the family image. Throughout our history, William Harrison avoided public scandal. He was a man of quiet Southern dignity, prioritizing decorum over conflict. The relatives assumed he would demand I unplug the projector, command Valerie to lower her voice, and insist we settle our financial disputes behind closed doors. They waited for him to sweep the rot back under the rug. Valerie turned towards him. Her triumphant smirk faltered, replaced by a look of nervous anticipation. She stepped forward, reaching a hand out as if to assist him. "Daddy, please sit down," Valerie urged, her voice adopting a soothing, patronizing tone. "The stress is not good for your heart. I am handling this situation." William ignored her outstretched hand. He did not look at her. He limped forward, his gaze fixed entirely on the giant outdoor screen illuminating the patio. The dark text of the intercepted email thread glowed against his weathered face. He studied the digital evidence documenting Jessica's complicity and Valerie's embezzlement. He stopped a few feet away from the smart console, leaning heavily on his wooden cane. He took a slow, rattling breath. "I knew," William said. The two syllables hit the humid coastal air with the force of a physical blow. A collective gasp rippled across the horseshoe tables. The revelation defied the established narrative. The family believed the patriarch was an isolated, oblivious invalid, entirely reliant on Valerie's daily management. They assumed he was a helpless bystander in his own legacy. Valerie's arm dropped to her side. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her complexion a sallow gray. "Daddy, you are confused," Valerie stammered, trying to project a narrative of cognitive decline. "You do not understand what you are reading. Abigail is manipulating the documents." William turned his head slowly, locking eyes with his daughter. His gaze held no confusion. It held decades of accumulated sorrow and a deep, rigid clarity. "I am old, Valerie," he stated, his voice carrying a gravelly resonance that demanded absolute silence. "My body is failing, but my mind remains perfectly intact. I knew you were draining Eleanor's trust account. I saw the bank notices before you started intercepting the mail. I watched you buy those imported cars. I watched you book those European flights. I watched you parade around this town wearing jewelry financed by your own daughter's future." Aunt Diane covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes wide with shock. Uncle Richard slouched further into his chair, unable to process the magnitude of the patriarch's confession. The grandfather knew. The anchor of their bloodline witnessed the theft and allowed it to continue. The implicit question hung heavily over the patio. Why did he stay silent? Why did he allow Valerie to plunder the inheritance unchecked? William anticipated the unspoken judgment. He shifted his weight onto his good leg, leaning closer to the microphone resting on the podium near the projector. "You all just heard her threaten me," he told the staring crowd. "You heard her declare her absolute legal dominion over my medical care. That threat was not a sudden act of desperation. It was the exact same ultimatum she delivered to me 4 years ago when I confronted her about the missing funds." The courtyard fell into a deep, morbid quiet. The psychological layers of Valerie's tyranny were fully exposed. She held my medical power of attorney. William explained, his voice trembling slightly with the memory of the extortion. She told me if I alerted the authorities or hired an independent lawyer, she would transfer me to a state-run ward immediately. She threatened to isolate me, to take away my physical therapy, to ensure I died alone in a sterile room. She held my physical survival hostage to guarantee her financial immunity. The relatives recoiled in genuine revulsion. The financial theft was a crime of greed, but leveraging a paralyzed man's fear of isolation to secure a slush fund was an act of profound structural cruelty. The guests realized the matriarch they respected was operating a private dictatorship built on elder abuse. I was trapped. William confessed, staring at the flagstones. I lacked the physical mobility to fight her in court. I lacked the digital skills to bypass her control of my accounts. But I did not surrender. I knew I could not stop her directly, so I found someone who could. William turned away from the crowd and looked directly at me. The stern lines around his eyes softened into an expression of deep, quiet pride. 5 years ago, I watched Abigail struggling to pay her tuition, working late shifts at a diner. William recounted, I knew she possessed an analytical mind. I knew she held a rigorous, unyielding sense of justice. She was the only person in this bloodline immune to Valerie's manipulation. He tapped his wooden cane against the stone patio, emphasizing his next words. I could not access the trust funds to help her, William said. But I still controlled a small private pension account Valerie never discovered. I used that pension to quietly pay the final 2 years of Abigail's university tuition. I funded the specialized forensic accounting certification she required to secure her corporate job. I armed her with the exact skills necessary to eventually dismantle the corruption infecting this family. I played the long game. I waited for the day she would return and conduct the audit I could not perform myself. The revelation triggered a profound shift in the atmosphere. The patriarch was not a passive victim. He was a silent strategist. He operated behind enemy lines, funding the education of the scapegoat, knowing she would eventually return as the executioner. The digital presentation currently destroying Valerie's empire was literally financed by the grandfather she held hostage. The dramatic irony was staggering. Valerie believed she controlled the entire chessboard. She never realized her own father spent the last 5 years quietly training the queen who would ultimately deliver the checkmate. Valerie staggered backward, as if physically struck by the patriarch's confession. The wicked, triumphant smirk she wore moments ago was permanently erased. The illusion of her absolute legal control was incinerated. Her threats of probate court and state-run nursing homes meant nothing when the victim of that extortion publicly exposed the blackmail to 50 witnesses. William turned his attention back to his daughter. He straightened his posture, ignoring the pain in his paralyzed side. He summoned the final reserves of his patriarchal authority. You stood in front of this family today and tried to bill Abigail for sacrifices you never made, William declared, his voice booming over the quiet hum of the coastal breeze. You stole her inheritance to buy fake prestige. You manipulated Jessica into acting as your accomplice. You held my health hostage to secure your slush fund. He raised a trembling hand, pointing a finger directly at Valerie's chest. You are a thief, William pronounced the word, landing with the weight of a judge's gavel. You are an extortionist, and as of this moment you are no daughter of mine. The rejection was absolute. The patriarch severed the bloodline in front of the entire extended family. He stripped her of her title, her legacy, and her standing. The social foundation she spent 30 years cultivating collapsed into dust. Valerie looked around the courtyard, desperately searching for a single sympathetic face. She found only averted eyes and cold disgust. Aunt Diane refused to look at her. Uncle Richard stared at the ground. Jessica remained hunched in her chair, paralyzed by her own guilt. The 50 relatives who arrived ready to condemn me now viewed Valerie as a toxic, radioactive entity. The isolation was total and devastating. Valerie dropped to her knees on the hard stone patio. The expensive peach linen suit bunched around her trembling legs. She buried her face in her hands and began to weep. The cries were not the performative, theatrical sobs she utilized earlier to manipulate the crowd. They were the raw, ugly sounds of a predator realizing the trap they set had snapped shut on their own neck. She wept alone, surrounded by the ruins of her false empire. I watched her cry. I felt no pity. The surgical extraction of the rot was nearly finished, but a forensic audit is not concluded when the subject begins to cry. An audit concludes when the legal paperwork is signed. I turned away from my weeping mother and reached into the pocket of my blazer, preparing to deliver the final lethal blow to her remaining illusion of power. I looked down at the woman weeping on the stone patio. The expensive peach linen fabric of her suit absorbed the dirt and moisture from the flagstones. Her manicured hands shielded her face from the harsh afternoon sun and the judgmental stares of the surrounding guests. For 30 years, she utilized tears as a weapon to manipulate the narrative and control the emotional temperature of every room she entered. Now those tears were a genuine byproduct of her own collapsing empire. A cold, sterile smile formed on my lips. It was the exact expression I reserve for the final hour of a corporate audit, when the corrupt executives realize the paper trail is sealed. 10 minutes ago, you stood on this terrace and made a very specific promise, I said. My voice sliced through the humid coastal air, carrying a sharp clinical authority. You threatened to tie my life up in probate court for a decade. You boasted about your unassailable status as the executor of the estate. You believed your medical power of attorney granted you immunity from the consequences of your theft. Valerie stopped sobbing long enough to peer up at me through her tangled blonde hair. Her eyes were red-rimmed and bloodshot, reflecting a desperate, cornered confusion. You relied on a very common misconception, I told her. Narcissists always assume their localized structural power makes them untouchable. You thought because you controlled the family checkbook and bullied a paralyzed man, you could outmaneuver the entire legal system. But you forgot my profession. I do not litigate family disputes in local courthouses. I build financial profiles for federal jurisdictions. I raised my smartphone and dragged my thumb across the glass interface for the final time today. The projector obeyed the command. The digital evidence exposing Jessica's complicity vanished from the outdoor canvas. The new image illuminating the courtyard was not a bank ledger or an intercepted email thread. It was a formal legal decree. The document bore the unmistakable, intricate seal of the United States District Court. Let us discuss your executor status, I suggested, pacing slowly toward the glowing screen. The 50 guests leaned forward, their eyes tracking the dense legal jargon projected behind me. The older relatives adjusted their glasses, attempting to decipher the official terminology. This is an emergency ex parte injunction, I explained, breaking the legal language down into plain, undeniable facts. I filed the preliminary forensic audit findings with a federal judge 72 hours ago. When an officer of the court sees irrefutable evidence of six-figure wire fraud involving a protected custodial trust, they do not wait for a local probate hearing. They act immediately to stop the financial bleeding. I pointed to the bold text stamped near the bottom margin of the projected document. As of yesterday morning, your status as trustee was officially revoked, I announced. The judge ordered an immediate freeze on all your personal and business bank accounts. Your real estate assets have been placed under a federal lien. And most importantly, your medical power of attorney regarding William Harrison is permanently terminated due to verified gross negligence and documented elder abuse. The patio remained dead quiet, save for the rhythmic hum of the oscillating fans. The sheer speed and brutality of the legal strike left the audience paralyzed. Valerie did not hold the keys to the kingdom anymore. Her financial accounts were locked. Her leverage over the patriarch was obliterated. The scorched earth threats she delivered mere moments ago were rendered entirely impotent by a single judge's signature. You cannot hire the most aggressive defense attorneys in the state, I told her, looking down at her kneeling form. You cannot afford their retainers because you no longer have access to stolen capital. You are financially marooned. The realization washed over Valerie's face, draining the last remnants of defiance from her posture. The fortress she built using intimidation and stolen currency was leveled by the relentless efficiency of the federal court system. She was exposed, disowned, and broke. But a forensic audit requires a formal conclusion. Exposing the crime is only the first phase. Delivering the penalty is the final necessary step. I pulled my phone away from the smart console sensor, severing the Bluetooth connection. The giant outdoor screen went black, leaving the courtyard bathed solely in the natural, dappled sunlight filtering through the live oak branches. I unlocked my device and opened my messaging application. I selected a prearranged contact and typed a single letter. I pressed send. Throughout the entire luncheon, a team of caterers had hovered near the perimeter of the estate, carrying silver trays of crab cakes and refilling crystal water pitchers. They wore crisp white aprons blending seamlessly into the background of the upscale Southern event. When the argument escalated, they tactfully retreated into the shadows of the catering tents, conforming to the unspoken rules of hospitality staff, avoiding family drama. When my text message delivered, two of those men stepped out of the shadows. They did not walk with the deferential gliding steps of service workers. Their posture shifted, adopting a rigid, purposeful stride. The taller man reached up and unfastened his white catering apron, letting the fabric drop onto a nearby serving station. He wore a plain gray suit underneath. His partner followed suit, revealing a matching professional uniform. The 50 relatives watched in profound confusion as the two men crossed the stone flagstones. They bypassed the horseshoe tables, ignoring the whispering cousins and the stunned aunts. They walked directly toward the head table. They were not hired to serve champagne. They were licensed process servers. The taller man reached into the interior pocket of his suit jacket. He withdrew a thick, heavy manila envelope sealed with a red tamper evidence strip. He stopped 3 feet away from Valerie. "Valerie Harrison," he asked, his voice projecting a flat, bureaucratic detachment. Valerie stared at his polished leather shoes, unable to formulate a verbal response. She offered a slow, trembling nod. "You have been served," the man stated. He dropped the thick envelope onto the flagstones directly in front of her kneeling form. The heavy packet landed with a dull, resonant thud. The two men did not offer a polite farewell. They turned in unison and walked back toward the iron security gates, exiting the estate without a backward glance. The manila envelope sat on the patio like an unexploded ordnance. "That packet contains your federal subpoenas," I informed her, breaking the stunned silence of the courtyard. "It includes the mandatory summons for the upcoming fraud hearings. But more importantly, it contains a settlement offer drafted by the Department of Justice." I walked over to the mahogany banquet table. The crisp, forged promissory note still rested near my empty plate. Resting right beside that fraudulent contract was the heavy, gold-trimmed Mont Blanc pen Valerie had tried to force into my hand at the very beginning of the hour. I picked up the writing instrument. The polished metal felt cool and substantial against my fingers. It was an expensive status symbol purchased with embezzled money. Valerie brought this pen to the luncheon, intending to use it as the tool of my financial enslavement. She planned to watch me sign away my future to protect her own. The poetic justice of the moment was too perfect to ignore. I turned my back on the table and walked toward my mother. My heels clicked rhythmically against the stone, matching the steady cadence of my breathing. I stopped inches away from the manila envelope. I crouched down, lowering myself to her eye level. I held the gold Mont Blanc pen outward, offering it to the woman who spent 30 years trying to break my spirit. "The settlement agreement inside that envelope requires a full admission of guilt," I said, my voice dropping to a quiet, intimate whisper meant only for her ears. "It requires immediate forfeiture of your remaining liquid assets to fulfill the restitution orders. It strips you of your real estate brokerage license." Valerie stared at the gold pen. Her breath hitched, trapped in her throat. Her hands rested limply in her lap, devoid of any strength to reach forward. "You have a very simple choice to make right now, Mom," I told her. I placed the heavy pen on top of the manila envelope. "Sign the settlement," I instructed. "Sign it, confess to the embezzlement, and accept the civil ruin." I stood back up, towering over her kneeling figure. "Or refuse the pen and the FBI arrests you for wire fraud on Monday morning." The ultimatum echoed across the patio, cementing the checkmate. I defeated her emotional extortion with flawless, irrefutable legal execution. The false narrative was destroyed. The stolen funds were traced. The matriarchal tyranny was dismantled permanently. Valerie stared down at the Mont Blanc pen resting on the brown paper envelope. The expensive gold trim caught a stray beam of coastal sunlight, mocking her defeat. She did not reach for it immediately. She simply stared at the instrument of her own demise, trapped in a prison constructed entirely by her own arrogance. She was utterly and comprehensively ruined. The aftermath of a targeted forensic strike is never loud. The screaming and the theatrical performances vanish the second the legal reality settles into the room. What follows is a hollow, suffocating vacuum. Valerie remained kneeling on the flagstones. During her descent a few moments prior, her elbow clipped the edge of the mahogany table. A crystal champagne flute tipped over the edge and shattered against the stone. Shards of delicate glass mixed with the Alabama dirt, scattering around her designer heels. The spilled liquor pooled in the crevices of the patio, catching the afternoon sunlight. She stared blindly at the manila envelope and the gold pen. She wept, but the sound lacked any manipulative edge. It was a ragged, rhythmic gasping. An hour ago, she commanded this courtyard. She orchestrated a lavish luncheon, controlled the seating chart, and directed 50 relatives to participate in my public execution. She was the undisputed matriarch, the generous benefactor, the wounded mother demanding justice. Now she was merely an exposed felon sitting in a puddle of spilled champagne, and no one moved to comfort her. The 49 remaining guests realized the venue was no longer a family reunion. It was a localized hazard zone. The federal subpoenas sitting on the ground acted like a radioactive core, and every person sitting under the live oaks wanted to escape the blast radius. A silent, panicked exodus commenced. Chairs scraped backward in a chaotic, uncoordinated symphony. Purses were snatched from armrests. Linen napkins were dropped onto half-eaten plates of catered food. The relatives did not offer farewells. They did not pause to console the woman they had vigorously defended just 20 minutes earlier. The social hierarchy evaporated, replaced by a primal, urgent need for self-preservation. I watched Aunt Diane gather her belongings. The woman who boldly declared that a mother does whatever is necessary to protect her child could not even look at her sister. Diane kept her eyes glued to the toes of her shoes. She sidestepped the head table, navigating a wide arc to avoid stepping anywhere near Valerie's kneeling form. She scurried toward the exit, her shoulders hunched, desperate to distance herself from the embezzlement she had unwittingly cheered on. Uncle Richard abandoned any pretense of Southern dignity. The man who puffed out his chest and shouted at me to respect his sister practically sprinted across the lawn. His face remained a sickly pale gray. He shoved his way past a lingering caterer, tossing a valet ticket at the parking attendant stationed near the iron gates. He needed to get to his vehicle, he needed to call his own accountant, and he needed to figure out how to hide the consulting fees before the Department of Justice froze his business accounts. He ran like a man fleeing a burning building. Within 90 seconds, the sprawling horseshoe arrangement was effectively abandoned. My smartphone resting quietly in my palm began to vibrate. It was not a single notification. It was a relentless, continuous mechanical buzzing that numbed my fingertips. I glanced down at the screen. The locked display lit up with dozens of message previews cascading down the glass in rapid succession. The extended family group chat was imploding. Without Valerie's iron grip to enforce the narrative and mandate their loyalty, the relatives turned on each other. The digital thread became a bloodbath of accusations and frantic denials. Cousins typed furious paragraphs demanding to know if their college graduation gifts were funded by stolen money. Aunts accused uncles of knowing about the theft and remaining silent to protect their own loans. The artificial unity cultivated over 3 decades splintered into 50 jagged pieces of paranoia. They were cannibalizing their own ecosystem. I did not open the application. I did not care to read the specific insults or the desperate backpedaling. I swiped my thumb across the notification banner, muting the conversation permanently. Their panic was no longer my jurisdiction. The rhythmic strike of a wooden cane drew my attention away from the fleeing guests. Grandpa Harrison navigated the uneven flagstones, bypassing the empty chairs and the abandoned tables. He moved with a slow, determined dignity. The stern, hardened lines of his weathered face relaxed as he approached me. He did not possess the physical strength to offer a crushing embrace, but he reached out with his good arm, wrapping it around my shoulders. I stepped into the hug. It was not a tearful cinematic reconciliation. It was a quiet, firm acknowledgement between 2 individuals who survived a long, bitter war. He smelled of starch and peppermint soap. "You executed that perfectly, Abigail," he murmured, his voice a low, gravelly rasp near my ear. I pulled back, looking into his eyes. "We are finished here, William," I said. David stepped forward, materializing at my side. My husband possessed an innate ability to read the logistical requirements of any situation. He knew the patriarch needed immediate extraction before the local authorities or the estate lawyers descended on the property. "I will drive you back to your residence, sir," David offered, placing a steady supporting hand under William's elbow. "We will arrange a meeting with independent counsel tomorrow morning to secure your medical directives. Valerie will not be making another decision on your behalf." William offered a short, grateful nod. He allowed David to guide him toward the perimeter of the courtyard, leaving the wreckage of his daughter's empire behind. I stood alone near the media console, evaluating the remaining debris. At the far end of the head table, Jessica remained seated. She had not joined the panicked exodus. She lacked the physical energy to run. She sat in her wooden chair, a portrait of profound ruin. Her designer silk wrap dress looked like a shroud. Her posture was vacant, hollowed out by the crushing weight of public humiliation and impending federal scrutiny. She built her entire identity on being the favorite. She followed the rules, parroted the lies, and happily accepted the financial rewards of her compliance. She sold her morality for a down payment on a luxury home. Now the home would be seized, the bank would audit her brokerage license, and the family she desperately tried to impress viewed her as a treacherous accomplice. Jessica slowly lifted her head. Her ruined makeup stained her pale cheeks. She looked at me, her eyes pleading for a sliver of sisterly grace, a final word of comfort to soften the blow. I offered nothing. The raw data provided all the necessary commentary. I turned my back on my sister and faced the smart console. I tapped the disconnect icon on my mobile device. The Bluetooth pairing severed instantly. The giant high-definition outdoor display erected behind the terrace went pitch black. The bright, sterile light that projected the emancipation, decrees the bank ledgers, and the damning email threads vanished. The sudden absence of the projector beam altered the atmosphere, making the humid courtyard feel smaller and significantly colder. The digital autopsy was officially concluded. I slipped my phone into my pocket. I walked toward the edge of the stone terrace, stopping beside David, who waited patiently near the perimeter path. Together we looked back at the waterfront venue one final time. The visual was cinematic in its desolation. The extravagant rented estate, decorated with expensive magnolias and catered luxury, sat entirely empty. It was a hollow stage constructed for a play that violently collapsed in the first act. In the dead center of the patio, Valerie remained on her knees. She sat in the dirt, surrounded by the glittering shards of her shattered champagne flute. Her head hung low, her blonde hair obscuring her face. Resting on the stone directly in front of her was the thick brown manila envelope containing the federal indictments and the gold pen she tried to use as a weapon. She was a deposed tyrant isolated in a prison built entirely by her own arrogance. David shifted his stance, weaving his thick, calloused fingers through mine. His grip was warm, grounding, and fiercely protective. "Are we ready to go?" he asked quietly. I looked at the water of Mobile Bay shimmering darkly in the late afternoon sun. The crushing, invisible weight of being the designated family failure, the scapegoat carrying an unearned debt, was gone. The ledger was balanced. The accounts were closed. "Yes," I replied. We turned our backs on the silent courtyard. We walked toward the heavy iron security gates, the gravel crunching steadily beneath our shoes. We passed the empty valet stand and stepped out onto the coastal highway. The humid coastal breeze caught my hair. We did not look back. The tires hummed a steady low frequency against the asphalt of the Bayway Bridge. The late afternoon sun cast long amber streaks across the surface of the water separating Point Clear from Mobile. Inside the cabin of our truck, the climate control system blew a steady stream of cool, dry air, erasing the suffocating humidity of the coastal estate. I rested my head against the glass passenger window, watching the marsh grass blur into a continuous ribbon of green and gold. For the first time in my adult memory, my spine relaxed against the upholstery. The phantom burden I hauled around since childhood, the heavy, suffocating label of the ungrateful daughter, evaporated into the chilled air. The release did not trigger a manic euphoria or a triumphant adrenaline rush. It left a sprawling, immaculate quiet. David kept his right hand resting steadily on the steering wheel. He reached across the center console with his left hand, intertwining his calloused fingers with mine. We did not turn on the radio. We did not dissect the chaotic exodus of my aunts and cousins, or analyze the pitch of my mother's weeping. The raw data was officially submitted into evidence. The emotional audit was permanently closed. The justice system operates with a cold, grinding efficiency when guided by federal prosecutors. 6 months evaporated since that sweltering confrontation under the live oaks. The structural collapse of a Southern matriarch is not a swift cinematic explosion. It is a slow, methodical dismantling of every pillar she used to prop up her false identity. Confronted with the digital paper trail, the intercepted email communications, and the sworn testimony of her own father, Valerie possessed zero leverage to mount a legal defense. To avoid a mandatory prison sentence for felony wire fraud, she capitulated and signed the Department of Justice settlement agreement. The terms required absolute asset forfeiture. The state regulatory board formally revoked her real estate brokerage license, effectively exiling her from the professional community she used to feed her ego. The courts liquidated her retirement portfolios, seized her imported luxury vehicles, and auctioned off her designer jewelry to satisfy the court-ordered restitution. Last Tuesday, she formally filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy protection. She currently rents a drab vinyl-sided duplex on the dusty industrial outskirts of the county line. The socialites and relatives who once flocked to her catered holiday parties do not answer her phone calls. The profound isolation she routinely weaponized against me became her permanent, unyielding reality. She reigns over a kingdom of nothing. My older sister encountered a different specific variant of ruin. The Internal Revenue Service does not forgive tax liabilities generated by embezzled down payments. When the estate attorneys reviewed the historic district property transaction, the federal examiners flagged Jessica's capital gains as the fruit of a poison tree. She was legally compelled to list the luxury home on the open market immediately. The lending bank seized the generated equity to repay the stolen inheritance. Jessica currently resides in a cramped two-bedroom apartment situated directly above a noisy commercial strip mall. The monogrammed clothing, the pristine social media facade, and the flawless golden child persona vanished. They were replaced by the grinding daily anxiety of living paycheck to paycheck. We do not speak. I blocked her contact information the exact moment we drove out of the estate gates, and I never revisited the decision. Some betrayals cannot be mended with time or superficial apologies. Her willingness to serve me up as a sacrificial lamb to protect her mortgage severed the final biological tether connecting us. The favored daughter traded her integrity for a house she could not keep, and now she possesses neither. William Harrison successfully reclaimed his autonomy. Armed with the protection of an independent legal counsel, he transitioned out of the restrictive environment Valerie mandated. He selected a beautiful private assisted living community overlooking the eastern shore of the bay. He spends his mornings reading historical biographies on a sunlit veranda surrounded by medical professionals who treat him with genuine respect. He calls me every Sunday afternoon. We discuss the shifting coastal weather, the upcoming hurricane season, and David's latest woodworking projects. We never mention the missing money or the women who attempted to steal it. My own daily existence remains outwardly identical to the life I led before the ambush. I still wake up early and brew black coffee. I still commute to my corporate office, spending my hours tracing hidden offshore accounts and dissecting fraudulent ledgers. David continues to build custom cabinetry, turning raw timber into solid, reliable foundations. We live peacefully in our modest brick house, but the internal landscape of my mind is fundamentally altered. The lingering, insidious doubt, the quiet voice whispering that I was inherently flawed is permanently silenced. When you grow up designated as the problem child, you internalize a profound sense of unearned debt. Toxic people rely on that internalized shame. They construct their power structures on your polite silence. They assume you will swallow their lies because defending yourself requires violating the unwritten social contract of familial loyalty. They bet their survival on the premise that you would rather be compliant than be right. But shame is a fragile organism. It cannot survive the harsh, unforgiving light of undeniable facts. It withers when exposed to chronological timelines and certified bank statements. You do not need to outshout a manipulator. You do not need to match their theatrical tears or engage in their manufactured drama. You simply need to bypass their emotions and document their actions. If you are listening to this and you recognize the architecture of the ambush, I survived. I want you to understand your own leverage. The people who designate your value before you even have a chance to speak do not own your narrative. Their verdict is not the truth. It is just a projection of their own rot. If you have ever been handed a bill for a debt you did not owe, drop a comment below. Hit subscribe if you know the power of keeping the receipts. You do not have to scream to win. You just have to let the numbers speak. When the dust settles on a shattered family dynasty, what remains is rarely anger. It is usually a profound, echoing silence. Think back to the empty patio in Point Clear, the shattered crystal lying in the dirt, and the abandoned banquet tables. The spectacle was merely a symptom. The underlying disease was a total distortion of what it means to be a parent. In the pursuit of maintaining a pristine traditional facade, a mother reduced her sacred biological duty to a transactional ledger. She forgot that parenthood is a foundation meant to be built upon, not a quarry meant to be mined for personal gain. We live in a society that often equates visible success with moral virtue. We applaud the luxury vehicles, the sprawling historic homes, and the perfectly curated holiday cards. But beneath that veneer of traditional family values, a dark psychological economy can take root. The concept of an emotional invoice. The idea that a child owes a tangible debt simply for being raised, fed, and sheltered is the ultimate betrayal of the parental contract. Children do not submit an application to be born into our households. They arrive as vulnerable dependents entirely reliant on our grace, our fairness, and our honesty. Raising a child is a profound responsibility, a unilateral commitment of time, resources, and love. It is not a loan accruing interest. When a parent begins to view their sacrifices as a line of credit waiting to be called in, they cease to be a caregiver. They become a creditor. And a home managed by a creditor will never provide true emotional safety. This distortion of family responsibility fractures the very architecture of the home, most visibly in the relationships between siblings. Consider the tragic dichotomy of the golden child and the scapegoat. In a healthy family structure, fairness does not mean identical treatment. It means equitable emotional support based on each child's unique needs. It requires a high degree of emotional awareness from the parent to recognize their children as autonomous individuals rather than extensions of their own ego. But in a toxic ecosystem, affection is weaponized. The favored child is purchased through conditional praise and financial bribes, trapped in a gilded cage where their loyalty is continually audited. They are taught that love requires total, unquestioning compliance. The scapegoat, conversely, is burdened with the family's collective shadow, blamed for the systemic rot they did not create. By pitting siblings against one another, a parent destroys the most enduring peer relationship a person will ever possess. The siblings are robbed of a lifelong ally, forced instead to play roles in a theatrical production directed by narcissism. Long-term guidance for a child does not look like a forced public confession or a demand for repayment. True guidance is often quiet, unassuming, and devoid of applause. Look at the patriarch of the story, William Harrison. Trapped in a failing body and held hostage by his own daughter, he did not surrender to the corruption. He recognized his granddaughter's innate sense of justice and quietly funded her education. He planted a seed in the dark, knowing he might not live to enjoy the shade of the tree. That is the essence of generational responsibility. It is the willingness to provide the tools for your children or your grandchildren to thrive independently, even if their success ultimately exposes your own family's flaws. Real family duty is rooted in unwavering honesty. It requires a parent to look in the mirror, acknowledge their own financial and emotional shortcomings, and refuse to pass those burdens down the bloodline. When we strip away the generational wealth, the country club memberships, and the meticulously ironed linen suits, the core of the American family is tested by truth. A family tree rooted in deception will eventually wither, regardless of how beautifully it is pruned for the neighbors. The tragedy of the manipulative parent is that they build their own isolated prison. By demanding an unearned return on their maternal investment, they bankrupt the only currency that actually matters, genuine human connection. They are left sitting alone in the wreckage of their own design, realizing too late that respect cannot be extorted and love cannot be subpoenaed. We share these narratives because the dynamics of control, manipulation, and eventual liberation resonate far beyond a single coastal estate in Alabama. They echo in dining rooms and holiday gatherings across the country. If you have ever felt the suffocating weight of an unearned family debt, or if you are currently navigating the complex, painful process of auditing your own childhood, you are not navigating it alone. We invite you to join our community. Subscribe to the Revenge Order channel for more stories that pull back the curtain on hidden truths and celebrate the quiet, undeniable power of the facts. Let us know in the comments how you navigate the delicate balance of family loyalty and personal boundaries. As you step away from this story and return to the rhythm of your own daily life, take a moment to reflect on the tables you sit at. Look at the faces gathered around your own holiday dinners. We all carry inherited ledgers, mental accounting books filled with old grievances, unspoken expectations, and generational obligations. The true challenge of adulthood is learning which debts are genuine and which are simply ghost stories designed to keep us small. The next time someone hands you a bill for a sacrifice you never asked them to make, you might pause and look closely at the ink. You might wonder, is the ledger truly balanced, or are you just paying for a past that was never yours to begin with?